Hello and greetings. Welcome to another Perspectives chat. In the previous one, I had spoken about some of the ideas in the book, The People of the Secret, and I did wish to follow that on with some related ideas. But in the meantime, something just crossed my radar from what I've been reading now, and I wanted to just make a quick perspectives talk on it. It's a subject which I've been aware of, and I'm a bit I have to consider whether to speak about this because it is, I think, a delicate matter. But as I mentioned before in my writings, and I've mentioned a couple of times in my talks, it's important to be aware of certain aspects because when we're aware of them, then we can choose discernment to kind of be detached from them. But I think if we're not aware of things, they don't go away. Just because of unawareness or ignorance, things don't go away. So I think awareness is important as long as we don't entangle with them. And as I've said before in my work, I quoted from the Gnostic Gospel of Philip, where it is said, "So long as the root of wickedness is hidden, it is strong. But when it is recognized, it is dissolved. When it is revealed, it perishes. It is powerful because we have not recognized it." So recognition is important because many things exist and have effect simply because we don't recognize them, or they don't enter our belief system or reality set. And therefore they can have an effect, a presence that goes undetected and can be all the more effective for that. So I'd like this to be a quick chat, but I'm reading now a book that's been on my list for a while and I've been wanting to get around to it. It's what I call a non-work book, which means more of a kind of pleasure reading. Despite the subject. It's a book by Malachi Martin. Malachi Martin being a Jesuit or ex-Jesuit priest, and he was a close confidant of Pope John Paul II, and he had a high position in the Vatican, and he left his Jesuit position so he could write and talk about things that he was aware of in the world, but mostly related to the Vatican, the Roman Catholic Church, etc. Malachi Martin is an interesting figure. He's written some interesting novels, such as Windswept House, and before that, Vatican, which he gives a lot of information, inside information, in a novel form or a fiction form. I've actually spoken about Malachi Martin in one of my very earliest Perspectives chats, when I was talking about the prophecy of the Fatima, the third prophecy of Fatima. But actually, the book I'm reading now is actually called Hostage to the Devil. And this was first published in 1976. And it's very much related to the exorcism and possession. And I think that the film The Exorcist had a great correspondence to the events in this book, even though it was based on the book by William Peter Blatty around the same similar time. But Malachi Martin has a lot of information, inside information, because of his position in the Roman Catholic authorities and hierarchy. Now, the book actually is about Malachi Martin speaking about 5 particular exorcisms that took place in America, and he's interviewed everyone involved, the victims involved, the priests involved who did the exorcism, the families involved, and he constructs a very detailed historical and story around each one based on the facts, and it's very in-depth, and it's interesting to read, to actually know what goes on and how people react and how certain forces are operative. So if anyone actually thinks that possession is a fiction, a fantasy, a Hollywood meme, then they are mistaken. But I think there's many degrees of possession, and not just the one devil possession. We are possessed by thoughts, opinions, ideals and ideologies, but that's another level. But I just want to talk briefly about this because the book was originally published in 1976, and Malachi Martin did a new introduction to the re-edition. It was republished in 1992 with a new preface by Malachi Martin, which I think is interesting because it points to, I think, the situation in the world today. And this, what I'm talking about, actually ties into my previous perspectives before the last one, where I talked about is the world in trauma, and I spoke about some aspects there of certain social cultural behavior. I think I'd like to tie it in with this, the nature of certain forces and the nature of trauma on the world stage. So I'm reading from the preface that Malachi Martin wrote in 1992. And he first says that, going back to why he first wrote the book, he says, the incidence of exorcism has been on a steady rise. There has been a 750% increase in the number of exorcisms performed between the early 1960s and the mid-1970s. Each year, some 800 to 1,300 major exorcisms and some thousands of minor exorcisms are performed. And I think he's talking principally about America there. And of course, he's talking about the 60s and 70s. So we can only imagine how that's changed since. And he puts things into more context. He says, again, talking from his preface, he says, we know that throughout all 50 states of the Union, again, talking about the North American Union, all 50 states of the Union, there are now something over 8,000 Satanist covens. We know that in any major American city or large town, a black mass, almost always organized by covens, is available on a weekly basis at least, and at several locations. We know that the average membership of Satanist covens is drawn from all the professions, as well as from among politicians, clergy, and religious. We know too that in many public schools in any major city, it is a virtual surety that there is at least one group of teenagers engaged in ritualist Satanism. I won't go into some more details there. But he says, still more shocking is the realization of the fact that in this, the America of the 1990s, 30 years ago, one is never far from a center where such activity is carried out on a routine basis. No one lives far from some geographical area where some form of ritualistic Satanism is practiced. Ritualistic Satanism and its inevitable consequence, demonic possession, are now part and parcel of the atmosphere of life in America. The difficulty is that as individuals and as a society, we are no longer willing, many of us no longer able, to give an answer to the question that will satisfy anyone for long. Such pervasive cultural desolation is the most fertile ground one could possibly imagine for the causes of possession to take root and flourish in almost unimpeded freedom. And he says, the ultimate camouflage is not to believe in evil. And so you are not armed against it. To disbelieve is to be disarmed. If your will does not accept the existence of evil, you are rendered incapable of resisting it. Those with no capacity for resistance become prime targets for possession. So, some heavy stuff there. But what he's saying is that there's been a huge increase in Satanism at that time. But at the same time, there's been a huge increase in the desolation, the cultural desolation of our societies. He's talking about the American society in his specific context. And that cultural desolation leaves a person most open to some form of possession. Now, it doesn't have to be a demonic possession. There are other people who's talked about certain elementals, certain thought forms taking into our minds. So, but there can be some form of external interference. Of course, demonic possession, Malachi Martin, in looking at it from a Roman Catholic point of view, which is in a mythology of the demonic and demons, there are many elementals or thought forms or entities which are non-visible or do not belong to our reality, but they can intervene and cross over perhaps. But anyway, there are interventions, let's say, in the human being, the human body, the human mind, that can be of undue influence. Now, that's what I just want to point towards, because if we don't recognize that, then we can be open to being unduly influenced. So we have to be prepared of the food we intake. Just as we ingest our food and our beverage, we ingest impressions, we ingest external influences, we ingest external thought forms, external temptations. So it's important to be aware of that. But of course, in modern times, Malachi Martin was speaking about 30 years ago. And originally, when he wrote the book, it was half a century ago, in the early 1970s. Look at the case today, and images and symbolisms of this kind of, let's call it Satanistic symbolism, is absolutely everywhere. And I don't want to put any images, but people who are aware of this will have seen it in modern pop videos, in live performances, in the clothes people wear, even so-called well-known high-ranking celebs going to gala dinners dressed in demonic outfits. So, a lot of this symbolism is being pushed. At the same time, we have a lot of cultural deterioration. We have a lot of trauma being played out on the world stage. We have a lot of anxiety and fear. We have a lot of emotional impact from what we've seen in the news, and also the way the propaganda shares that. So all these can act as some form of intervention. In fact, as some form of possession. We can be possessed by a very heavy emotion, a heavy anger. We can be possessed by certain aspects of fear and panic. All these, I think, kind of, coalesce together. There may not be demonic possession, but there are possession of thought forms and external influences. So whenever people, an individual or a group or a community is in a certain state of depression, anxiety, fear, or trauma, feeling victimhood, these are all states of lower weakened immunity. Not just physical immunity, but we could say vital energy immunity. Our vitalism is lowered. When the vitalism is lowered, we are more susceptible, perhaps, to intervention. And I'd like to point here to the work of a scientific philosopher, spiritual scientist, David Hawkins. And David Hawkins has been researching for over 20 years, and he's muscle tested over 250,000 people. This is a form of kinesiology, where you muscle test a person to see their their kind of reaction and their strength in their body. And the strength in their body is related to their mind, their consciousness, their state of being. And overall, and some of you may be familiar with his work. Some people like his work, some people do not. But I think it has a important message. And the message is of course that the state of our consciousness affects, of course, our strength, our bodily immunity. And he made this chart here, and you can see that, of course, what he's saying is that when there are certain states on the left, going up from shame, guilt, apathy, grief, fear, desire, anger, pride, these are the lower emotions or lower infections that can lower the person's state of consciousness, lower their physical and spiritual immunity. And also, he says, it gives them an inability to discern truth from falsehood. We're in a lower state of functioning. The human being is a lower state of functioning mentally, physically, emotionally, and the ability to discern from external impacts. Now, he puts a dividing line around courage, because then a person has to take the courage to take responsibility for their consciousness, for the food they ingest to feed their consciousness. Of course, first you get a neutrality, meaning that you break away from the programming. You break away from accepting propaganda and external conditioning. So then you start to act upon yourself. You take the willingness and the acceptance to critically evaluate things. And then, of course, we have the higher impulses of reason, balanced reason, that is, not dogmatic reason, love, joy, peace, enlightenment. So what he says is that when we take on those forms of consciousness, the one of acceptance, willingness, love, joy, peace, and I think there's more as well. There can be compassion and empathy and forgiveness. Then we have a stronger physical immune system. Our muscle testing shows that our body's immune system is stronger. And not only that, but our consciousness has a higher awareness and therefore the ability to discern truth from falsehood. So what I'd like to say there is, just to finish this message, is that it's important to be aware of certain external interventions and certain states, because that awareness gives us the ability to discern from it and to make the detachment. And then, of course, we can develop our physical and spiritual immunity in these times of cultural disarray and dissonance. So there's a lot of mess out there in the world, a lot of nonsense, a lot of manipulations. And I just like to say that, we are all now, I think, quite reasonable, mature adults, and we need to take responsibility for the food we ingest from the external world. Perhaps at this stage, as little as possible, maybe we need to go on an external food diet so we don't ingest too much of it, and be very aware of the impressions that we do take in as our food. And just to finish with, I'd like to tell a story. And a good friend of mine sent me this story the other day, which nicely ties into what I'm speaking about now. And I thought that I would read it out. And the story is from a book called The Magic Monastery by Idris Shah. Once upon a time, there were three kinds of people on a certain planet. There were those with one stomach, those with two, and those with three stomachs. At first, nobody realized that there was any difference between them. They lived in different areas and adopted the food and habits which corresponded best with their stomachic peculiarities. But as they multiplied, their differences became matters of contention. Sometimes the monostomachics prevailed, sometimes the bistomachics, sometimes the tristomachics. Then with realism and through a desire for equity, they decided to abolish all differences based on stomachs. The result was that people, happily enough, eventually forgot that there were any of these anatomical differences. They now had a unified culture, which was completely blind to this detail. Even the technological instruments devised by the people did not register stomach differences. And then a new element crept in. As food supplies increased in quantity and decreased in quality for unforeseen reasons, the monostomachics and the bistomachics could not endure the new diet and began to die out. Because the ancient taboo against knowing anything about stomachs had been established even in the genetic inheritance of the people, nobody could solve the problem, and only the tristomachics survived. There's a lot to be said about what that story could signify, and my friend did give some very good potential interpretations, but I'd like to leave that to everybody else to make their own interpretation of that story. So, as always, eat well, be healthy in what you consume, be energized, and be well. But as always, stay grounded. Okay, cheers.